As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Baqarah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu wa taqwallah wa dharru ma baqiya min riba inna kuntum mu'minin فإن لم تفعلوا فأذنوا بحرب من الله ورسوله. Allah Azza wa Jalla says, and what could mean, O you who believe, remain fearful of Allah, have taqwa, and give up all of your outstanding gains, all of your riba, all of your interest-based transactions, if you are truly believers. But if you do it not, then take notice of a war from Allah Ta'ala and His Messenger. So we begin by initiating a conversation about the essence of things, shying away from the stated and proclaimed intention, and not taking things at face value in a world where that is absolutely naive and impossible to do, inshallah. We can see, if we look at the next slide, inshallah ta'ala, that the rise in Sharia-compliant finance has been steady and exponential for many years. And the slide says that over the past few years, Islamic finance has received increasing attention from the global financial industry, not least because of the remarkable growth Sharia-compliant assets have experienced. And then it says since 1975, assets have grown by 15 to 20% each year, while in 2008, the value of Sharia-compliant assets grew by 28.6%. That's phenomenal numbers. The value of the Islamic finance market is approximately $1 trillion. That's as of 2010. That's the number that's now being touted in all of the reports. Whilst this value is small when compared to global market capitalization, which means that it actually represents a very small portion of the global economy, Islamic assets represent approximately 1 to 2% of global assets. The growth rate is impressive and expected to continue. And then we have this breakdown of the chart that you see in the lower right-hand corner, where it says these assets are predominantly located amongst banks in the Middle East and Malaysia. So you see 79% in the Middle East, 11% in Malaysia alone, 2% in the UK, and the rest of the world represents 8%. So you see the breakdown in the chart below. Now the issue is one in which we have a fledgling or a nascent industry, which we'll discuss the history of in the next session. So we're going to talk about where modern Sharia-compliant finance initiated, but not today, inshallah. But the important thing to highlight for today's discussion is how Sharia-compliant finance is portrayed as, one, a rapidly expanding version of finance, two, as an alternative means of finance altogether, meaning something completely different than, finance, riba-based, interest-based Western finance, and discuss the reality that when Muslims read news and information about the industry, one would wonder and think that the quote-unquote Sharia-compliant finance field is a counter to Western financial systems. And while we continue to analyze this claim in light of several dimensions throughout this course, a quick precursory view of the reality suggests that both of these touted situations are not reality at all. So we deal with the first one initially. The statement that Islamic Sharia-compliant finance is rapidly expanding, growing at just enormous rates. The question is, how do we arrive at this number of $1 trillion in Sharia-compliant assets? The reality, when we analyze this statistic, is that this is largely guesswork by academics or people that work in the field. And this is due to the non-transparent nature of the societies in the Middle East and stereotypes and misinformation that many hold about the region. The truth is that while Islamic finance presents itself as an alternative to conventional finance, not only in Muslim countries but in the rest of the world as well, exact figures and operations and holdings are very difficult to arrive at. For example, if we look at statistics from 2006, before the 2008 financial crisis, quoted numbers between 200 and 750 billion, shorter than the 1 trillion they quote today. Today there's a near unanimous effort to quote this $1 trillion mark. Banker magazine, global data collector for the financial sector, and probably one of the most reliable, actually listed the top 500 Islamic financial institutions in 2006, and they showed a growth rate of about 30% in 1 year from 2005, reaching a total of $500 billion, with strong indications of serious underreporting, meaning that they could not locate a lot of the quote-unquote Sharia-compliant funds. So even a look at calculations suggests that they are largely undocumented speculation. Do I have sound, inshallah? For example, the General Council of Islamic Financial Institutions, which is an organization in Bahrain, maybe won't be up and running much longer, estimated in 2006 that assets were $300 billion. But Iran, a country that, to which many people would add another 200 billion or more these days, is not a member of this council, and so Iran goes uncounted in their analysis. In fact, most of Iran's data with regard to Sharia-compliant finance is hard to scrutinize, yet it makes up around about a third of any report that quotes $1 trillion with relation to the field. So the Iranian situation is a major hurdle inside any accurate estimate. And when you have around 200 billion or even more of Western banks that are in that number too, so there's Western banks that do partial Sharia-compliant products, they make up about 1/5 of any estimate that would develop a $1 trillion figure. And many times it's hard to determine exactly which assets they even own in the Middle East, as banking operations are done there both through Islamic branches and conventional branches, and they have what they call windows operations, where there's a one track where it's interest-based and then another where it's Sharia-compliant, quote-unquote. So the problem of data collection is one, and reporting is one, which is manifold and evident. And I say that in the beginning to let people know that what we will be analyzing, inshallah ta'ala, is the nature, the essence of the industry, rather than trying to quote some numbers and look at statistics, because, to be quite honest with you, the statistics are so unreliable when with regard to the field that it is almost laughable, to be quite sincere. The $1 trillion level is often quoted, and we know why they quote the $1 trillion level, because it sounds huge. It's like the largest number that we think about when we think about economics, and it allows us to imagine that it's just some huge amount and percentage of the global financial industry. But let's ask that question. Let's pose that question. Is $1 trillion an exorbitant number in the financial arena? I mean, let's look at the next slide that I've prepared for tonight's discussion and analyze the $1 trillion number in relation to some other things. Clearly, if you look at slide 4, Sharia-compliant industry, 1 trillion in relative terms, you'll see that it is not. For example, HSBC, what was once known as the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, originally a UK empire's funneling financial mechanism to engage in the opium trade between China and then the British East India Company in India, which was profiting off the opium trade and now becomes one of the biggest banks in the world, which we will discuss as part of its influence with Sharia-compliant field and banking generally, actually holds $2.418 trillion in assets. That's one bank that has significantly greater number, even if we accept the $1 trillion claim, and so on and so forth. We see Goldman Sachs has 911 billion. That's almost equivalent to 1 trillion. The total assets of UBS of Switzerland in 2005 was 1.53 trillion. Mizuho Financial Group of Japan, that's just one firm, 1.5 trillion. And Citigroup's assets as per March 31st, 2008 were 2.2 trillion. We all know Citigroup because it's Prince Talal from Saudi owns a significant share, but even that is twice this size of 1 trillion. So let's not be mesmerized by the notion that this is posing some sort of quantitative and qualitative challenge to international finance. Other statistics, just, you could make your own chart like this. This is just what I did quickly. 1 year GDP of the GCC countries in 2008 is 1 trillion alone. So 1 year GDP of cumulative GCC countries is over the entire amount of assets held in Sharia-compliant finance. The Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, one of the sovereign wealth funds of the GCC countries, alone is $600 billion. Taking the growth rate of Citigroup and other major banks, we see a similar order of magnitude as the 15% often quoted for the Islamic finance industry. So when we look at the growth of other banks, which we could do on a separate slide, but we'll save time, we see the quoted 15 to 20% growth is just normal in the financialized industry. It's average. From 1978 to 2008 in the United States, cumulative debt of the financial industry grew alone from 3 trillion to 36 trillion. So the reason that I post this slide is because 1 trillion is very minute in relation to the global financial system, and it's especially minute when we consider the actual revenue and income of the countries that claim to be promoting the quote-unquote Sharia-compliant paradigm. We do not have reliable data for Gulf country sovereign wealth funds, but looking at the estimates above for Abu Dhabi, we see that it alone, one sovereign wealth fund, is representative of 600 billion in revenue. That's almost the entire Sharia-compliant field. So we also know that Gulf Capital holds major positions in companies like Barclays. We know, as we talked about, Prince Walid bin Talal holds a major share percentage of News Corp and Citigroup, and these operations alone both rival the size of the expressed 1 trillion in Sharia-compliant finance holdings. And Gulf Capital is also a primary shareholder of brands like Aston Martin and Ferrari. We know of the decisions and development and failure of Dubai to acquire primary ports in America, and we will discover a bit here today about the large petrodollar recycling scheme, which witnesses the overwhelming amount of money that is generated within Muslim nations, generated by our oil, flow back to the West or to other foreign countries that use dollar bills to purchase it through what is known as the petrodollar recycling scheme. And this wealth is vastly and exponentially larger than the entirety of the Islamic finance industry. So it is safe to say, analyzing relative terms, that a basic precursory glance of the numbers, while 1 trillion indeed sounds very large and like the Muslims are coming, is really not in any way a paradigmatic threat from a numbers perspective. The yearly American GDP is over $10 trillion each year, and global GDP is about 50 trillion. So before we even analyze the products themselves to see who benefits, the nature, the essence, and the practice of the industry, or anything else, we must realize that we are dealing with a nascent industry, a very, very new industry. And I would argue that that's good and bad in many ways. For example, it is an indicator that the environment in which the Sharia-compliant industry exists is as important as addressing the industry itself. That the exogenous factors we must consider, exogenous meaning outside of just looking at the industry itself, what influences it, has a vast potential for modification, alteration, and change that could push the industry in a positive direction. And that is what this course aims to do, inshallah ta'ala.